Hi everyone, I'm Kimberly Anindo. I will be taking you through the next section. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm also an English language copy editor at Youth STEM Matters and a research organizer for this event. We're in the final stretch. I hope you all enjoyed Emir's session, and hopefully we see your writing soon in the Youth STEM Matters journal. Our next speaker of this section is Ayesha Tandon. Ayesha is a science journalist at Carbon Brief, a UK-based climate journalism and analysis group. She holds a Master of Science in Natural Sciences from the University of Exeter and previously worked at the UK Met Office as a climate science communicator. In her free time, she can often be found dancing or with her head buried in her book. Sounds like me. She will be giving a talk titled Tailoring Climate Communication to Your Audience. I'm so excited to hear about her tips and tricks, as I'm sure all of you are. If you have any thoughts for Aisha, please do share these in the chat. I would now like to welcome Aisha to the stage.
Hiya, I'm Ayesha, and I'm the science journalist at Carbon Brief, which is a UK-based climate journalism and analysis group. And I've been asked to talk today about why communication is important, why climate change communication in particular is important. Now, I am going to touch on that, but I think we can all agree that communication is important. If you can't communicate a concept with your audience, it's very unlikely that they're going to understand it. And I think the same is true of climate change. Communicating the importance of the issue, the urgency of the issue, is really key to making people care about it. And so what I want to discuss a bit more is how you can tailor that message to your audience and why it's important to communicate with different audiences in different ways. So, to start with, I've got a little exercise. So each of these images is the coverage of the 2019 Australian bushfires, which, as we all know, was driven in part by climate change. And each of these is trying to communicate to a different type of audience. So just for the next 10 seconds, have a look at them, look at the text, look at the use of images, look at how the points are laid out, and sort of think about who might have written these pieces and who they might have been for. And I'll just give you a second there. Okay, so I'll tell you that the one on the left is a press release from the University of Exeter, which I'm broadly using to represent academia. You can see the image isn't super prominent, it's quite a lot of text on the page. And when I was at Exeter, I was studying, doing my master's in natural sciences, and so I was in quite an academic space. The one in the middle is the UK Met Office, so you can see image is a bit more prominent, slightly bigger text, and it's got bullet points for its points. And when I was working at the Met Office, I was in a team called Knowledge Integration, and our aim was to communicate science with the general public and the government. So doing things like this, like bullet pointing issues to make it easier for government stakeholders to access the information easily was really important. And then on the right, we've got Carbon Brief, which is the journalism group I work at now. So you can see the image there is a custom image that we've made of lots of different newspaper front pages. Images are quite important in journalism, obviously, and we've got sort of the least text on the page out of all three. So I've learned a lot over the past few years about how my writing style needs to change to communicate with these different groups, and I just want to show you a bit of that today. So I've made a little scale, I guess, and so on the left-hand side we have academic papers. So these are maybe the most technical scientific outputs that you're going to get, those technical ways of communicating science. And generally an academic paper is aiming to communicate information with other academics. It's researchers talking to other researchers. And so they're fairly technical, jargon heavy. Whereas on the right, all the way over on the other side, we've got social media, which is really communicating to, social media can be used obviously by anyone to communicate with anybody, but in the context I'm looking at when we're trying to communicate with the general public on social media. Like, you'll notice that general public takes up about half of my scale, and that's because it's just such a broad range of people. General public can range from an audience who has maybe as much knowledge as the scientists, people who are really engaged in the topic, all the way to people who don't care about the topic at all, don't want to be engaged with it, and will only really read things if they really catch their eye. And so these are some of the different characteristics of these different groups that you might find. So in the middle, we have government communications and journalism. And when I say journalism, I'm sort of talking Carbon Brief level journalism, like long form journalism. But yeah, so governments as well, they want things that they can understand. They don't want too much jargon in there, but they will also want to know that the science is sound. They'll want some kind of methodology, and they are, hopefully, engaged in the topic. So you don't have to worry about being too attention grabbing or missing out the things that are important but maybe not as interesting, because hopefully your government audience will take the time to wade through a bit more of the technical language. And so this slide here is sort of what you would include in your writing. But there's also a way of writing that is important. And so when I was working at the Met Office, I would write a lot of web pages for the general public. And I found this, it's called the Flesch Reading Ease Score, and it goes from 0 to 100, where 0 is very difficult to understand and 100 is very easy to understand. And we used to aim for kind of 80, and I'll tell you now that writing about climate change with a score of about 80 is really, really, really difficult. So I'll tell you how the score is calculated in a second, but first, just have a look at these 3 points and think about roughly what score you would give each of them. I'll just give you 30 seconds for that. So these are the scores. Top one's 32, so classed as difficult to read. Got 56 for the middle one, fairly difficult to read. And the bottom one is 76, so fairly easy to read. So even that, 76, is still not at the level that's conversational English for the majority of people. And this is something I try to remember whenever I'm writing, is to bring down the number of syllables in my words, use shorter words, and make my sentences shorter, especially when I'm giving presentations like this to a more general public, maybe less engaged in climate change audience. Shorter words, shorter sentences make things easier to understand, and the equation is there at the bottom for anyone who wants it. So that's the language that you use, but then what order do you present the information in? The narrative. The narrative is also really important. So I'm just going to whiz through this quite quickly, but for an academic paper or an academic presentation, like what I was trained to do, there's a pretty set narrative. You have your abstract at the top, which is a summary, then your introduction, which is setting up the question, why do we care about this question? What's the background literature on it? Then, okay, so these last two sometimes can be interchangeable, but then for me, I was told that method comes next. So what did you do? Technical details, and then your results and your findings. And that's how you present to an academic audience. If you present to a government audience, so at the Met Office, I used to write these cover sheets, which are single page summaries of papers. Again, you start with a summary at the top, but then you jump straight to the headline findings, the recommendations of action to be taken. And you assume that if the government person only reads that far, that they have all the information they need. Then below that, if they want to read more, then they can look at the background and methodology, but that's not the priority. Okay, so then we have for an engaged general public, so like a Carbon Brief audience, that's where you have to start thinking of a title, which is something I'd never had to think about before. With a cover sheet that wasn't a title, with academic papers, the titles can be quite jargon heavy. You didn't have to think of an eye-catching title, but that's really important. And then again, sort of a similar structure to the government cover sheets. You want to have your most important information at the top, the most interesting results, findings, and then as you go down, then you can get to technicalities. And that's because you're assuming that your reader is not going to make it the whole way through the piece. At Carbon Brief, we collect statistics on how far through the piece readers make it, and I can't share the exact numbers, but I will say that there is a very high drop-off rate, and a lot of people will just click on the page and then bounce off it. So they just kind of read the headline, read the top 2 sentences, and then bounce. So your headline and your top 2 sentences need to be solid. And then for your unengaged general public, it's just sort of headline summaries. I do a lot of tweets, sort of Twitter threads summarizing papers, and it's just sort of bullet points. You don't go into any technicalities at all. You've got to put a lot of images and emojis in there, keep people engaged. You're really aiming to grab people's attention, and you have to assume that if it's not interesting, they're going to just move on. So speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about figures and images. So I'm just going to whiz through this very quickly because I know I'm running out of time. At the Met Office, we used to produce a lot of infographics. So these are quite large images that the reader can take time to look at the image and read all the text And there is a lot of information in there. It's just about making it a little bit easier for the reader to engage with. So these are infographics for the State of the UK climate reports, and they have most of the main findings from the report in there, and then images to make that text a bit easier to get through. So then at Carbon Brief, again, we also have infographics. This is a couple of examples of Carbon Brief infographics. We also have a lot of multimedia, so interactive graphics. So this is an interactive graphic that our design studio made for one piece that I did, which was fantastic. This is something that we put on Instagram, I think. This one on the left, which shows different pathways to reducing emissions, to hitting 2 degrees C warming. And you can see with this one, it builds, it invites the reader to keep watching through it, and to get to the end. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how are we going to get our reader or our viewer to the end of the video. So it's sort of about building suspense almost. And so we'll have the text description at the side as well. But the main thing is we want this image or graphic to be really eye-catching and have some kind of reveal at the end. And I think this one did do quite well. Then Twitter threads. So I do quite a lot of these. And so this was a Twitter thread for a piece that I did recently about systemic biases in climate publishing. And so what I usually do is the first 3 or 4 tweets, it depends how big the piece is, just go through the graphics. That's what this is here, the main graphics of the piece, not all of them. And then for this one, because it was such a long piece, I then pulled out some quotes from the people I'd interviewed, and you can see that I've tagged the people that I interviewed in these tweets. And then the beauty of threads is you can just keep adding. So underneath that, every time my piece got picked up by some other news outlet like BBC or The Lancet, I was adding tweets onto the end of that thread. So that's what these last few tweets are here. It's other coverage of my thread, and these last tweets I didn't add with the original thread, they came later. Now, I would be remiss to talk about communication without very briefly mentioning Ed Hawkins' climate stripes. I'm sure you've seen these all before, but these are a fantastic example of communication because they don't involve any text, any numbers, any real explanation. You can have an explanation if you want it, and I think that's why this works for so many different types of audiences. If you want more detail, you can get more detail, but you don't need it. Just this level of graphic will work for everybody. So that's all from me. I hope you all really enjoy the rest of the conference. And yeah, take care, everyone.
Thanks to Ayesha for talking us today. This was very informative. Communication makes sense when you know your audience and your audience understands you. Remember to share your highlights on social media using hashtag YouthSTEMMatters and tag at YouthSTEMMatters 2013.